Hello everyone, and welcome back. Thank you all for your incredible support. It truly means a lot. I'm Mr. Darkness, and I bring you scary park ranger stories with relaxing sounds to help you fall asleep. Subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. There is a specific kind of quiet that only exists in the deepest parts of the Pacific Northwest. A silence so heavy and damp that it feels less like the absence of sound and more like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. It is the silence of old growth, where trees that were saplings when Columbus sighted land stand so tall and thick that they choke out the sun, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual, emerald twilight. For 5 years I thought I understood that silence. I thought I knew every creek, every game trail, and every weather-worn ridge of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. I was wrong. My name is Silas Vance. I am 34 years old, and in the autumn of 2017, I was working as a seasonal backcountry patrol ranger for the United States Forest Service, stationed in a remote sector of the Trapper Creek Wilderness. The events I'm about to recount have never been recorded in any official logbook, nor did I report them to my district ranger. To do so would have meant an immediate psychiatric evaluation and the permanent loss of the career I had spent my entire adult life building. But the weight of holding this inside has become too heavy, and with the passage of time, I feel a desperate need to put the truth down on paper, if only to convince myself that I am still sane. The autumn of 2017 was unusually wet, even by Western Washington standards. By late September, the transition from summer to fall hadn't been a gradual cooling, but rather a sudden violent onslaught of cold, gray rain that saturated the mossy earth until the forest seemed to weep from every branch. I was assigned to the Observation Peak Patrol Cabin, a small, rustic cedar plank structure built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It sat on a high, timbered saddle miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a steep, muddy trail that wound through stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar. The cabin was equipped with a wood-burning stove, a propane cooktop, a set of bunk beds, and a hand-cranked shortwave radio that was our only link to the ranger station in Carson, some 25 miles to the south. I wasn't supposed to be alone up there. My scheduled partner had blown out his knee on a wet log 3 days before our hitch began, leaving me to handle the high country patrol solo. However, the district office had approved a temporary arrangement. A visiting academic from Sweden, a soil biologist named Niels Lindqvist, had received a federal grant to study mycorrhizal fungi networks in the undisturbed old-growth soils of the Trapper Creek area. Since he needed a base of operations and the Forest Service was short-staffed, it was decided that Niels would share the cabin with me for his 2-week field study. Niels arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, soaked to the skin but possessing an infectious, cheerful energy that immediately brightened the gloomy cabin. He was a tall, lean man in his late 40s with wire-rimmed glasses that were constantly fogging up and a thick woolen sweater that smelled of pine tar and stale coffee. He carried a heavy internal frame pack loaded down not with camping gear, but with soil augers, glass specimen jars, and a ruggedized field tablet. "It is beautiful here, Silas," he said, speaking with a precise, melodic Swedish accent as he peeled off his wet outer layers and hung them near the wood stove. "Back home in Norland, we have forests, yes, but they are managed. They are clean. Here it is chaotic. It feels very old, very stubborn." "It's stubborn, all right," I replied, throwing another split log of dry hemlock into the stove. "And it doesn't like visitors much when the weather turns. We're in for a rough couple of weeks, Niels. The forecast calls for a series of atmospheric rivers to dump on us." "You sure you're up for digging in the mud in this?" Niels laughed, a warm, booming sound that bounced off the low timber rafters. "My friend, I have dug soil samples in the permafrost of Abisko. A little Washington rain will not melt me. In fact, the moisture is perfect. The fungal mycelium will be highly active. They are communicating, you see. Under our feet, the entire forest is talking." For the first 4 days, our routine was peaceful and entirely ordinary. Niels would rise at dawn, brew a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve a nail, and set out into the dripping woods to take core samples at various elevations. I would spend my days hiking the surrounding trails, clearing fallen branches, checking the integrity of trail water bars, and ensuring that the few hardy backpackers still in the wilderness were adhering to leave-no-trace principles. By evening, we would meet back at the cabin, cook a simple meal of canned beans and salt pork, and talk by the yellow glow of a kerosene lantern. It was on the fifth night that the rhythm of our isolation began to fray. The rain had stopped around dusk, leaving behind a thick, suffocating fog that rolled up from the valleys, swallowing the giant trees in a sea of white wool. The temperature had plummeted, hovering just above freezing. Inside the cabin, the heat from the stove kept us comfortable, but the silence outside was absolute. In the PNW, when the fog gets that thick, it acts as an acoustic dampener. The sound of the wind, the dripping of water, even the distant rush of Trapper Creek down in the canyon, all of it was completely snuffed out. Niels was sitting at the wooden table, labeling small plastic vials of soil with a fine-tipped marker. I was sitting on the lower bunk, oiling my leather boots, when the sound first reached us. It was a whistle. It was not the sharp, shrill whistle of a human trying to get someone's attention, nor was it the warble of a bird. It was a long, low, hollow note that drifted through the fog, rising and falling in a strange rhythmic cadence. It sounded incredibly distant, yet at the same time, it possessed a weirdly intimate quality, as if the person making the sound was standing right outside the window, whispering it through the glass. Niels stopped his marker mid-stroke. He tilted his head, his eyes scanning the dark window panes. "Is that a bird, Silas? Some kind of owl?" "No," I said, putting down my boot and the rag. I stood up and walked to the door. "Not an owl. Not a varied thrush either. They have a single-note whistle, but it's much higher pitched than that. And they don't call at night in late autumn." We listened. The sound came again, slightly louder this time. It lasted for perhaps 10 seconds. A undulating, melancholy melody that seemed to mimic the rising and falling of a gentle breeze, though the air outside was completely dead. "Perhaps a hiker," Neil suggested, though his voice had lost its earlier warmth. "Someone lost in the fog? If they're lost, they'd be calling out," I said. "They'd be shouting help or blowing a whistle. Nobody wanders around the backcountry in a freezing fog just whistling a tune." I stepped out onto the small porch, the cold air hitting my face like a wet cloth. The fog was so dense I couldn't see the handrail of the steps. The world was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable white. I held my breath, listening. From somewhere out in the dark, maybe 50 yards away, the whistle sounded again. But this time it was different. It was closer, and as the note died down, it transitioned into a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a low clicking noise, like two hard stones being struck together in rapid succession. "Click, click, 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 hello," I shouted into the white void. "This is the Forest Service. Is there someone out there? Do you need assistance?" My voice felt flat, deadened by the fog. It didn't carry. There was no response, only the drip of condensation from the cabin's metal roof. "Silas," Niels whispered from the doorway. He had come up behind me, his tall frame silhouetted against the lantern light. "Did you hear that?" "The clicking?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked on the dark line where the forest edge should have been. "No," Niels said, his voice trembling slightly. "Not the clicking. After you shouted, listen." We stood perfectly still. For a long minute there was nothing. Then from the darkness a voice spoke. It was faint, muffled by the fog, but the words were clear. It was my voice. "Hello," the darkness said, using the exact cadence, the exact rising pitch I had used moments before. "This is the Forest Service. Is there someone out there?" A cold jolt of adrenaline shot through my chest. The imitation was perfect, but it sounded wrong, like a recording being played back at a slightly altered speed, devoid of any real human breath or emotion. It was a flat mechanical reproduction of my own voice. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy flashlight on my belt. I switched it on, throwing a bright beam of LED light into the fog. The light did nothing but illuminate the swirling moisture, creating a blinding wall of white a few feet in front of my face. There was no answer. We stood on the porch for another 10 minutes, the cold seeping through our socks, but the forest remained dead silent. Eventually, we went back inside, locking the heavy timber door behind us. I threw a few more logs into the stove, but the warmth of the cabin suddenly felt incredibly fragile, like a paper tent pitched in the middle of an ocean. Neil sat back down at the table, but he didn't pick up his marker. He stared at his hands, his knuckles white. "That was an echo, yes. The canyon walls. They can play tricks with sound." "There are no canyon walls in that direction," I said quietly, sitting on the edge of my bunk. "That direction is a flat ridge that slopes gently down toward the creek. There's nothing for sound to bounce off of, and even if there was, an echo doesn't wait 10 seconds to repeat you, Niels. And it doesn't sound like it was processed." "What do you mean, processed?" "It sounded like it was learning how to say the words as it was saying them," I said. Though as soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. It sounded insane. We didn't talk much after that. We went to bed, but neither of us slept. Every time the cabin creaked or the wind made a dry hemlock branch scrape against the roof, I felt my muscles tense. I kept my service flashlight and my folding knife on the small nightstand beside my bed, staring at the ceiling until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the grime-streaked window. By morning, the fog had lifted, replaced by a cold, steady drizzle. The forest looked normal again, just wet and green and indifferent. Niels seemed to have recovered his scientific skepticism during the daylight hours. Over breakfast, he laughed off the night's events, attributing it to a phenomenon called acoustic modeling, where temperature inversions in fog can warp and delay sounds in bizarre ways. "The human brain is wired to find patterns. Silas," he said, spreading jam on a piece of pilot bread, "we hear a strange wind, a bird, and our minds turn it into a voice. It is an evolutionary survival mechanism." Nothing more. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I had spent 5 years in these woods. I knew what wind sounded like when it whistled through rock chimneys, and I knew what a raven sounded like when it mimicked human laughter. What we had heard was something else. While Niels gathered his gear to head down toward the marshy flats near the creek, I decided to do a search of the perimeter around the cabin. I told him I was checking for wind damage to the trail, but my real objective was to find where that sound had originated. I walked out to the area where I estimated the voice had come from, about 50 yards northwest of the cabin, deep in a stand of old-growth Douglas fir. The ground here was covered in a thick carpet of sword ferns and decaying wood. Because of the constant rain, the soil was soft and muddy. If someone had been standing there, they would have left deep, unmistakable boot prints. I searched for an hour, casting back and forth in a grid pattern. I found no footprints. There were no broken branches, no disturbed moss, no signs that a human had been anywhere near the area. But just as I was about to give up and head back, I saw something that made me freeze. At the base of a massive, hollowed-out western red cedar, 3 pine branches had been driven into the soft earth. They weren't fallen branches. They had been deliberately stripped of their green needles, leaving them bare and skeletal. They were pushed deep into the soil, angled in a precise, neat tripod. Suspended from the center of the tripod, hanging by a thin strip of cedar bark, was a small, perfectly round river stone. The stone didn't belong here. The nearest river or creek with rounded stones was Trapper Creek, nearly 1,000 feet down a steep, treacherous gorge. Someone had carried this stone up the mountain, stripped these branches, and built this structure, and they had done it without leaving a single footprint in the soft, wet mud around the tree. I knelt beside the tripod, my heart thumping against my ribs. I reached out to touch the stone, but a sudden, overwhelming wave of revulsion washed over me. It was a physical sensation, a sudden tightening in my throat and a metallic taste in my mouth, like I was standing too close to an electrical outlet. I pulled my hand back. "Silas!" The shout made me jump. I spun around to see Niels walking up the trail from the cabin, his pack on his back. He looked concerned. "Silas, are you all right?" He called out. "You look like you have seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I said, quickly standing up and stepping in front of the tripod to block his view. I didn't want to frighten him, and more than that, I didn't want to explain something I didn't understand. "Just checking the runoff. The trail is holding up fine." Niels nodded, though he looked at me skeptically. "I am going down to the basin today. The soil chemistry there should be highly acidic, due to the cedar runoff. I will be back before dark." "Be careful down there," I said. "The rocks near the creek are slick as ice. And keep your radio on channel 2. "Always," he said with a cheerful wave, turning and disappearing down the switchbacks. I watched him go, then turned back to the tripod. I took a deep breath, reached down, and kicked the structure apart. The bare branches snapped easily, and the river stone fell into the mud with a dull thud. As soon as I did it, the heavy, oppressive feeling in the air seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of unease remained. I spent the rest of the afternoon doing routine maintenance, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. Every time I turned around expecting to see someone standing in the shadows of the hemlocks, there was nothing but the silent, dripping forest. Niels didn't return by 5 o'clock. By 6, the sun had set and the woods were plunged into a cold, pitch-black darkness. The rain had started up again, heavier now, drumming a relentless, deafening rhythm on the cabin's tin roof. I stood by the window, my face pressed against the glass, looking down the trail. Nothing but blackness. I grabbed my handheld radio, switched it to channel 2, and keyed the mic. "Niels, this is Silas. Do you copy?" "Over," static hissed back at me. I waited, then tried again. "Niels, this is Silas. It's past dark and the weather is worsening." "What is your ETA?" "Over," more static. Then through the white noise, a sound emerged. It wasn't Niels's voice. It was a rhythmic scraping sound. Screech, screech. It sounded exactly like someone dragging a heavy shovel across gravel. "Niels," I called out, my voice tight. "Niels, is that you? Adjust your squelch, I can't hear you." The scraping stopped. For a few seconds there was only the hiss of the empty channel. Then a voice spoke through the static. It was very faint, buried under the hiss, but it was unmistakably Niels's voice. "So deep," the radio whispered. "The roots go so deep." "Niels, what's your location? Are you hurt?" I yelled into the mic. The radio clicked off, returning the cabin to the damp silence of the rain. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my heavy yellow rain slicker, strapped my first aid kit to my pack, and took my agency-issued Remington 870 shotgun from the wall rack. We weren't supposed to carry firearms on routine patrol unless we had specific authorization. But the rules felt very far away right then. The shotgun felt heavy and solid in my hands, a reassuring piece of cold steel and polymer against a darkness that was growing more hostile by the hour. I stepped out into the pouring rain, my headlamp cutting a weak yellow tunnel through the downpour. The trail down to the basin was a nightmare of slick mud and exposed greasy roots. I slipped twice, once sliding nearly 10 feet down a muddy slope before catching myself on a vine maple. My hands were scraped and bleeding, but I didn't feel the pain. My mind was entirely focused on the image of Niels, injured and freezing in the dark down by the creek. "Niels," I shouted as I ran down the switchbacks, my voice instantly swallowed by the roar of the wind in the canopy. "Niels, can you hear me?" The deeper I descended into the canyon, the thicker the forest became. The giant Douglas firs gave way to massive western hemlocks and ancient, twisted cedars that leaned over the trail like hunched old men. The smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation was overwhelming down here, a heavy, sweet scent of decay that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I reached the bottom of the basin after 40 minutes of hard hiking. Trapper Creek was swollen and angry, a white torrent of foaming water rushing over black boulders. I shone my headlamp along the creek bank, searching for any sign of Niels's orange rain jacket. "Niels!" A sound rose above the roar of the creek. It was a whistle. This time it wasn't distant. It was close, incredibly close. It came from a dense thicket of devil's club and huckleberry bushes just 30 feet away, on the opposite side of the trail. The whistle was loud, vibrant, and filled with a strange, mocking energy. It went up and down, a complex looping melody that sounded almost joyful. I raised the shotgun, my shoulder bracing against the stock, my finger resting on the safety. "Show yourself," I screamed. "I am armed. Show yourself right now." The whistling stopped instantly. From the thicket, a low, wet, rustling sound emerged. Something was moving through the dense brush, but it wasn't running. It was moving slowly, deliberately, with a heavy, uneven gait. Thud, drag, thud, drag. I shone my headlamp directly into the bushes. The leaves of the devil's club, covered in sharp yellow spines, parted. I expected to see a bear, or perhaps a mountain lion, or even a lost hiker. What I saw instead was Niels. He was standing in the middle of the thicket. His orange rain jacket was gone, leaving him in his gray woolen sweater, which was now torn and soaked with black mud. His glasses were missing, but it was his face that made me take a step back, my boot slipping on a wet rock. His eyes were wide, completely dilated, staring blankly into the beam of my light without blinking. His mouth was open, his lips parted in a wide, unnatural grin that stretched his face so tightly his skin looked ready to tear. He was standing on one leg, his other leg bent at an awkward, unnatural angle, dangling uselessly. "Niels," I whispered, my heart freezing. "Oh God, Niels, what happened? Did you fall?" He didn't answer. He didn't blink. He just stood there smiling that terrible, vacant smile in the beam of my headlamp. "Niels, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I slowly lowered the shotgun, though I didn't put the safety back on. "I'm going to help you. We need to get you back to the cabin. Can you walk at all?" Niels's head tilted. It didn't tilt like a human neck tilts. It jerked to the side, a sudden sharp movement that looked like a bird tracking a worm. "Silas," his voice said, but his lips didn't move. The mouth remained wide open, frozen in that horrific grin. But the words came out of his throat, muffled and dry. "Silas, the roots go so deep. The soil is very rich here." "Niels, stop," I said, a wave of cold dread washing over me. "Let's go. Come on." I stepped forward, reaching out a hand to grab his arm. As I got closer, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of wet wool or mud. It was the smell of a freshly opened grave. A deep, ancient smell of stagnant water, old rot, and turned earth that had never seen the sun. As my hand neared his sleeve, Niels's body suddenly jerked. He didn't move toward me. Instead, he was pulled backward into the darkness of the thicket. It wasn't a natural step. It looked as if something invisible had hooked him by the collar and yanked him. His boots dragged through the mud, leaving deep, narrow trenches. "Niels," I yelled, plunging into the thicket after him. The sharp thorns of the devil's club tore at my face and hands, but I didn't care. I pushed through the wet leaves, my headlamp scanning the darkness. Niels was moving through the dense forest at an impossible speed for someone with a broken leg. He wasn't running. He was sliding through the trees, his body remaining upright, his head still tilted at that horrific, broken angle, his face still turned toward me, smiling through the dark. I chased him for what felt like miles. Deeper and deeper into the trackless wilderness far off the trail. The terrain rose sharply, becoming a chaotic maze of fallen giant logs, deep ravines, and slippery clay banks. I was panting, my lungs burning, the rain stinging my eyes. I kept my light on him, but no matter how fast I ran, the distance between us remained exactly the same, about 40 feet. He moved through the thickest brush without a sound, his body slipping between the tight trunks of young hemlocks as if he were made of smoke. Then, he stopped. He was standing at the edge of a deep, dark sinkhole, a place where a giant cedar had fallen decades ago, leaving a massive root wad and a deep crater in the earth. The hole was filled with black, stagnant water and rotting debris. Niels stood on the lip of the hole, his back to the crater. He looked at me, his wide, unblinking eyes reflecting the blue-white light of my headlamp. "Silas." His voice came again, still dry, still dead. "It is very quiet down here. You should listen." "Niels, please," I sobbed, the terror finally breaking through my professional reserve. I was trembling so hard I could barely hold the shotgun. "Just come back with me, please." Niels smiled wider. The skin at the corners of his mouth split, a thin trickle of dark, sluggish blood running down his chin. Then he leaned backward. He didn't fall. He simply let himself tip over the edge of the sinkhole, falling face first into the black water. "No," I screamed. I rushed to the edge of the hole, shining my light down into the water. It was deep, perhaps 6 feet, choked with black muck and decaying branches. I expected to see his orange, slickered body thrashing, or his hands reaching for the surface. The water was completely still. There were no bubbles, no ripples. The black surface was as smooth as glass, reflecting the light of my headlamp back at me like a mirror. I fell to my knees, plunged my hands into the freezing, foul-smelling water, and began to claw through the mud and rot. I dug my arms in up to my elbows, feeling for fabric, for skin, for anything. My fingers met only soft, slimy decay and cold, wet roots. I dug deeper, my mind screaming, until my hands caught on something solid. I pulled. It was heavy, resisting my grip. I hauled it out of the water, expecting to see Niels's face. It was a bundle of bare, stripped pine branches, bound together with a strip of cedar bark. Suspended from the center was a large, heavy river stone. I dropped it as if it were a burning coal. I stood up, stumbling backward, my breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. The forest around me had gone completely silent. The rain was still falling, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The wind had died down. Then from the darkness behind me I heard the whistle. It was low, melancholy, beautiful. And then, from another direction, a second whistle joined in. A third, A fourth. The whistles rose from all around me, circling the sinkhole, shifting distances instantly. A chorus of hollow, mechanical notes that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of my boots. Underneath the music, I could hear the wet, heavy sound of things sliding through the mud, moving closer, closing the circle. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I turned and ran. I ran through the pitch-black woods, blindly crashing through branches, falling down muddy banks, scrambling over rotting logs. I dropped my shotgun somewhere in the dark, but I didn't stop to look for it. I ran until my chest felt like it was going to burst, until my legs turned to lead, driven by a primal animal terror that I had never known existed. Somehow, by some miracle, I found the trail. I hauled myself up the switchbacks, my boots slipping in the mud, until I saw the yellow light of the cabin window through the rain. I burst through the door, slammed it shut, and threw the heavy wooden bolt. I dragged the heavy cedar table across the floor, wedging it against the door, then pushed the bunk beds against the window. I huddled in the corner of the room, my knees pressed to my chest, holding my folding knife in my hand, staring at the door. For the rest of the night they were there. They didn't try to break the door down. They didn't break the glass. Instead, they walked around the cabin. I could hear their footsteps on the porch, heavy, uneven, dragging footsteps. Thud, drag, and they spoke. They spoke in Niels's voice. They spoke in my voice. They spoke in voices I didn't recognize. Voices of men, of women, of children, all of them flat, dead, and mechanical, repeating the same phrases over and over again. Is there someone out there? The roots go so deep. It is beautiful here, Silas. Hello? Hello? They whistled. They clicked stones together. They tapped on the cedar siding of the cabin, their fingers sliding along the wood with a dry, scraping sound that sounded like autumn leaves blowing against the wall. I pressed my hands over my ears, closing my eyes, praying for the sun to rise. I stayed in that corner, shivering in my wet clothes, until the gray morning light slowly filled the cabin, and the sounds outside finally, mercifully, faded into the normal drip of the rain. I didn't wait. As soon as it was light enough to see, I cleared the door, stepped out onto the porch, and ran down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, where my green patrol truck was parked. I drove straight to the ranger station in Carson. I told them Niels had slipped and fallen into Trapper Creek during a flash flood, and that I had been unable to recover his body. A search and rescue team was dispatched immediately. They spent a week combing the basin, using search dogs and dive teams. They found his backpack, his field tablet, and his soil samples near the creek bank, but they never found his body. The official report concluded that he had been swept downriver into the Wind River and eventually into the Columbia. I resigned from the Forest Service 3 days later. I moved east, away from the mountains, away from the giant trees and the wet green silence. I live in a flat, dry place now where the sun shines almost every day, and the trees are small and sparse. But even here, when the weather turns and the fog rolls in off the plains, I find myself locking my doors and windows. Because sometimes, late at night, when the wind dies down and the world goes quiet, I think I can hear a low, hollow whistle drifting across the flat earth, calling my name in a voice that is not quite my own. My name is Silas Vance. I am 34 years old, and in the autumn of 2018, I was working as a backcountry patrol ranger for the United States Forest Service in the state of Washington. Specifically, I was stationed in the northern reaches of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, a vast, staggeringly dense wilderness that drapes over the Cascade Mountains like a heavy, dark green velvet shroud. It is a place of unbelievable beauty, but if you spend enough time there alone, the beauty begins to curdle into something else. The scale of it becomes oppressive. The trees, mostly ancient Douglas firs, western hemlocks, and massive red cedars, grow so tall and thick that they choke out the sun, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual state of damp, green twilight. I had been with the service for nearly 6 years by then. I wasn't some greenhorn who got jittery when a branch snapped in the dark. I had handled everything from aggressive black bears and washed-out trails to the grim, quiet task of recovering the bodies of hikers who had misjudged a cliff face or succumbed to hypothermia. I knew how to read the woods. I knew the difference between the high-pitched shriek of a cougar and the agonizingly human-like scream of a red fox. I knew the maps of my sector better than the lines on my own palms. But what happened in October of that year forced me to resign my commission, pack up everything I owned, and move to a cramped, noisy apartment in the concrete heart of Seattle, where the only trees are planted in neat, predictable concrete boxes along the sidewalk. Even now, 2 years later, I keep the blinds drawn. The late season in Gifford Pinchot is always quiet. By October, the casual tourists have gone home, chased away by the persistent freezing rain that rolls in off the Pacific. The air smells of wet earth, decomposing cedar, and the sharp, clean scent of subalpine fir. The fog doesn't just hang in the air. It moves through the valleys like a living thing, thick and gray, swallowing the mountain peaks and turning the giant trees into towering, ghostly silhouettes. My primary station was a remote patrol cabin, located off an unmaintained logging road near the western boundary of the Indian Heaven Wilderness. It was a simple, sturdy structure built of hand-hewn logs in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It had a stone fireplace, a propane stove, a bunk, and a shortwave radio that was my only connection to the ranger station down in Trout Lake, some 25 miles of rough dirt road to the south. My supervisor was a veteran ranger named Dale Miller. Dale was 58, with a face like weathered basalt and a quiet, deliberate way of speaking that immediately calmed you down in an emergency. He had spent his entire life in the Pacific Northwest and knew the local lore, the terrain, and the people better than anyone else alive. On the second Tuesday of October, Dale called me over the radio just as the afternoon light was beginning to fail. The static was bad. It always was when the low clouds settled into the canyons, but I could make out his voice through the crackle. He told me that a vehicle had been found parked at the trailhead of an old, decommissioned path called the Spencer Butte Trail. It was a beat-up blue Subaru Outback, registered to a 24-year-old man named Julian Mercer from Portland. Mercer had been reported overdue by his roommate 3 days prior. He was an amateur photographer who specialized in capturing old-growth forests, and his roommate said he had planned to spend a couple of days shooting in the high country. He hadn't checked in and his phone was going straight to voicemail. "Silas," Dale's voice crackled through the small speaker, competing with the hum of the cabin's propane heater. "I need you to hike up the lower section of Spencer Butte first thing tomorrow. The county sheriff is putting together a search and rescue team, but they won't be on site until tomorrow afternoon. Just do a preliminary sweep of the trail corridor, see if you can find any sign of him, but keep your eyes open. The weather is supposed to turn nasty by midday." "Copy that, Dale," I replied, holding the heavy black microphone to my mouth. "I'll head out at first light." "Any known medical issues or experience level on Mercer?" "Roommate says he's fit, but he's not an experienced winter camper," Dale said. There was a pause, a long stretch of empty static that made me think the connection had dropped before his voice came back. Lower this time. "And Silas, if you find anything odd up there, you don't touch it. You just log the coordinates and call it in. You understand me?" "Odd like what?" I asked. "Just anything that doesn't look like a standard campsite or trail marker. We've had some weird reports from the mushroom pickers in that sector this fall. Just be careful." "Understood. I'll check in at 0700 before I head out." We ended the transmission. I sat at the small wooden table, drinking a cup of black coffee that had gone cold, listening to the rain begin to lash against the small, double-paned window of the cabin. The wind was picking up, making the massive hemlocks outside groan and sway. It was a lonely sound, but it was one I was used to. I prepped my gear for the morning. My heavy pack, a first aid kit, a high-powered flashlight, a handheld GPS, a satellite messenger, and my service-issued Smith & Wesson .40 caliber pistol. I didn't expect to need the gun in all my years. The only times I'd ever drawn it were to put down an elk that had been hit by a logging truck. But the weight of it on my hip was a comforting constant. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. The cabin seemed to creak more than usual, the old log settling with deep, resonant pops that sounded like footsteps on the porch. Several times I found myself sitting up in the dark, straining my ears to listen over the rushing wind, convinced I heard someone calling my name from the tree line, but it was just the wind through the cedar boughs. It always mimics human voices if you listen to it long enough. The next morning broke cold and gray. A thick, wet mist hung just above the ground, obscuring the bases of the trees so that they seemed to float in a sea of white. I checked in with Dale at 7, strapped on my pack, and drove my patrol truck 3 miles up the muddy forestry road to the junction of the Spencer Butte Trail. The trail had been officially closed for nearly a decade due to frequent washouts and a lack of maintenance funds. Nature was quickly reclaiming it. Sword ferns, waist-high and dripping with cold water, choked the narrow path. Fallen logs, slick with green moss, barred the way every few hundred yards, forcing me to climb over or scramble under them. The silence was absolute. The rain had stopped for the moment, but the forest was soaked, the only sound being the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water falling from the high canopy to the forest floor. I hiked for about 2 hours, scanning the muddy ground for any signs of passage. It was difficult. The heavy rain from the night before had washed away any clear footprints, but here and there I saw broken ferns and scuff marks on the moss-covered rocks that suggested someone had passed through recently. Around 3 miles in, the trail began to climb steeply, hugging the side of a deep, heavily forested ravine. At the bottom of the ravine, a swollen creek rushed over black volcanic boulders, its roar muffled by the dense vegetation. It was here that I found the first sign of Julian Mercer. It was a camera lens cap, lying in the middle of a patches of mud near a massive, rotting cedar stump. It was a Nikon cap, 58 millimeters. I picked it up, wiped the wet mud from the plastic, and bagged it. Just past the stump, the trail split. My topo map didn't show a fork here, but a narrow, clearly defined path branched off to the left, heading down into the ravine toward the creek. I stood there for a moment, the damp cold seeping through my waterproof jacket. The air felt heavy, almost pressurized, the way it does right before a severe thunderstorm. The smell of decay was stronger here. Not the clean, earthy smell of rotting wood, but something sweeter, thicker, like wet hair and old copper. I decided to follow the side path. It was steep and treacherous, the slick clay soil offering little traction. I had to grab onto the slick branches of vine maples to keep from sliding down the slope. As I neared the bottom of the ravine, the roar of the creek grew louder, but underneath the sound of the rushing water, I heard something else. It was a whistle. It wasn't a bird. It was a human whistle, clear and high-pitched, carrying over the noise of the creek. It was a simple 2-note pattern, a rising tone followed by a sharp drop. I stopped, my hand instinctively resting on the butt of my pistol. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the damp air. "Forest Service." "Is anyone down there?" No answer. The whistle didn't repeat. I waited, listening so hard my ears rang, but there was only the sound of the water. I continued down to the creek bed. The canyon floor was dark, the steep walls blocking out what little daylight there was. Huge basalt boulders, slick with dark green algae, choked the watercourse. Nestled in a small sandy clearing beside the creek was a tent. It was a small high-end backpacking tent, bright orange, but it had been pitched poorly. The rainfly was half draped over the mesh inner body, and several of the guy lines were tied to loose branches instead of being staked into the ground. It looked like it had been set up in a hurry or by someone who didn't care about staying dry. "Julian?" I called out as I approached. "Julian Mercer?" "This is Ranger Vance." I drew closer. The tent door was unzipped, the nylon flap swaying gently in the cold draft that blew down the canyon. I knelt down and peered inside. The tent was empty of people, but it wasn't vacant. A sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, damp and stained with mud. A backpack sat open, its contents spilled across the nylon floor. A camp stove, freeze-dried food pouches, a headlamp, and an expensive-looking camera body with no lens attached. But what caught my attention, what made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, were the sticks. Dozens of them. Small stripped twigs of red huckleberry about 6 inches long had been arranged in neat geometric patterns all over the floor of the tent. They weren't just tossed there. They had been laid out with meticulous, terrifying precision. They formed circles, interlocking triangles, and strange stick figure shapes that looked like stylized human bodies with elongated limbs. In the center of the sleeping bag, a larger figure had been constructed out of thicker branches, bound together with strips of blue climbing webbing. It had no head, but where the head should have been, someone had placed a small round stone perfectly smooth and black. The sight of it sent a cold spike of dread through my chest. This wasn't the work of a hiker who had gotten cold and lost. This was something deliberate, something that felt deeply, profoundly wrong. I pulled out my radio. "Trout Lake, this is Unit 4, over." Nothing but a wall of harsh, rushing static. The deep stone walls of the ravine were blocking the signal completely. I knew I had to get to higher ground to report this, but I couldn't just leave. I needed to see if Julian was nearby. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the small clearing. The ground was rocky and hard, but near the water's edge the sand was soft. I walked over and looked down. There were footprints, dozens of them, but they didn't make sense. There were prints from heavy hiking boots, presumably Julian's, but they were scattered in wild, erratic patterns, as if he had been spinning in circles or pacing back and forth in a panic. Interspersed with the boot prints were other marks. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like the impressions of bare feet, but they were impossibly long and narrow, the toes splayed out like fingers, leaving deep, pointed indentations in the wet sand. The stride length between these bare prints was immense, nearly 6 feet apart, suggesting whatever made them was either running at an incredible speed or was unnaturally tall. The tracks led away from the tent, straight into the freezing, rushing waters of the creek. On the opposite bank, the forest rose up in an almost vertical wall of tangled devil's club and dense hemlock. There were no tracks on the other side. It was as if whatever had stepped into the water had simply vanished or had walked upstream through the torrent. "Julian," I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "Julian!" The forest seemed to absorb the sound, deadening it instantly. Then, from the dense timber on the far side of the creek, about 50 yards up the steep slope, I heard it again. The whistle. 2 notes. High, then dropping. It was louder this time, clearer. And then a voice called out. "Help," it said. The voice was thin, reedy, and flat. It had no inflection, no rise and fall of panic or exhaustion. It sounded like a person reading a word off a page they didn't understand. "Help, I am here." "Julian," I called, stepping toward the creek bank. "Is that you?" "Stay where you are, I'm coming to you." "Stay where you are," the voice repeated. It was instantaneous. It didn't sound like an answer. It sounded like a perfect, mechanical echo of my own words, delivered with that same flat, dead tone. But the pitch was slightly off, as if the vocal cords producing it were too thick, too long. "Julian, keep talking." "I need to pinpoint your location," I yelled, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Julian, keep talking," the voice replied from the trees. "I need to pinpoint your location." It was my voice. It was an exact imitation of my own voice down to the slight catch in my throat. But it was hollow, like someone speaking into a metal pipe. It came from the high branches of a massive western hemlock, way up in the canopy, 30 or 40 feet off the ground. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the freezing mist. I reached down and unsnapped the retention strap on my holster. "This is Ranger Silas Vance with the U.S. Forest Service. Identify yourself." "This is Ranger Silas Vance," the voice echoed from the tree canopy. "With the U.S. Forest Service. Identify yourself." The cadence was identical. The pauses between the words were identical. It was like listening to a tape recorder playing my own words back to me. But there was a strange, wet clicking sound beneath the words, like stones being tapped together underwater. I didn't cross the creek. Every survival instinct I had developed over a lifetime in the outdoors was screaming at me to run, to get out of that deep, dark ditch and back up to the ridge. But I was a ranger. If Julian Mercer was up in those trees, delusional, hypothermic, or worse, I couldn't just abandon him. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and shined its powerful beam up into the dark boughs of the hemlock. The light cut through the mist, illuminating the thick, moss-covered branches, the hanging clusters of lichen, the wet needles. Nothing. There was no one there. No orange jacket, no human shape. But as I swept the beam across the upper branches, I saw a movement. It wasn't a sudden flinch or a scramble. It was a slow, fluid unfolding of something dark, a shadow larger than a man, that seemed to glide from the trunk of the hemlock to the branches of an adjacent fir without making a single sound. No needles fell. No branches shook. The movement was impossibly smooth, like ink dissolving in water. And then the whistling started again. But it wasn't just one source now. A second whistle, identical to the first, came from the ridge behind me, the way I had just come down. Then a third further up the creek bed. They were answering each other, the high-low notes weaving through the roar of the water, creating a bizarre, overlapping rhythm that made my head spin. I backed away from the creek, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I kept the beam trained on the far bank, but there was nothing to see but the dense, dark wall of green. "I'm leaving," I muttered to myself, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm leaving," the voice whispered back. It didn't come from across the creek this time. It came from the bushes right beside me, not 10 feet away, hidden in the thick patch of sword ferns. I spun around, drawing my pistol in one fluid motion. I shined the light directly into the ferns. The fronds were perfectly still, but nestled in the mud at the base of the ferns, just where the light hit, was another stick figure. This one was larger, nearly 3 feet tall, constructed from thick, wet cedar branches. It had been placed there in the seconds since I had turned my back. The blue climbing webbing used to tie it together was still wet with Julian's scent. I could smell the cheap synthetic detergent on it. I didn't call out again. I didn't try to use the radio. I turned and scrambled up the steep clay bank, clawing at the mud, digging my boots into the slick earth, desperate to reach the ridge. Behind me, the whistling grew louder, faster. The notes were no longer clean. They were breaking apart, turning into a frantic, wet, chattering sound like thousands of teeth clicking together in the dark. I reached the main trail, my lungs burning, my chest heaving. The rain had started again, a cold, driving downpour that stung my face and blurred my vision. I didn't stop. I ran down the trail, my heavy pack bouncing violently against my back, my boots splashing through the deep puddles of mud. I expected something to burst out of the trees ahead of me, to see some towering, hideously misshapen thing waiting on the path. But there was nothing. Only the forest, dark and endless, and the sound of my own ragged breathing. But as I ran, I realized the forest wasn't empty. Every few hundred yards, I would hear a sound in the brush parallel to the trail. It wasn't the heavy thud of a deer or the crashing of a bear. It was a light, rapid tapping, tap, 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 tap. It sounded like someone running alongside me, high up in the steep slopes above the trail, matching my pace effortlessly, jumping from rock to rock, tree to tree, without ever making a sound on the forest floor. Whenever I stopped to catch my breath, the tapping would stop instantly. And then, after a second of dead silence, a voice would drift down from the fog-choked canopy. "Silas," it would say. It was Dale's voice now. It sounded exactly like Dale, with that dry, gravelly tone he got after a long shift. "Silas, hold up. I'm on the ridge. I see your light. Stop running, son." For a fraction of a second, my brain wanted to believe it. My body wanted to stop, to sink onto a log and wait for my friend, my mentor, to come down and tell me everything was going to be all right. But Dale was 25 miles away in Trout Lake. He was sitting in a warm office, drinking coffee. "Silas, hold up," the voice repeated, closer this time, just up the slope to my left. "It's cold out here. Let's head back to the truck. Get away from me." I screamed, aiming my flashlight into the dark timber. The light illuminated nothing but the gray trunks of the trees and the falling rain. But as I watched, a massive Douglas fir, easily 4 feet in diameter, groaned. The bark on its trunk seemed to twist, a long, deep spiral crack opening up with a sound like a gunshot. The tree didn't fall. It just groaned, its needles shivering in the windless air. I turned and ran the remaining mile to my truck. I didn't look back. I reached the forestry road, threw myself into the cab of the patrol truck, slammed the locks down, and started the engine. The headlights flared to life, cutting through the heavy mist, illuminating the empty dirt road ahead. I grabbed the radio mic, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. "Trout Lake. This is Unit 4. Dale, do you copy?" "Dale, please copy," the radio hissed. The static was a solid wall of white noise, but then, slowly, a voice began to emerge from the static. It wasn't the clear signal of the base station. It was faint, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep underground. "Silas," the radio whispered. "Dale, is that you?" I found Mercer's camp. "He's gone, Dale. There's something else out here. I need backup. I need search and rescue now." "Found Mercer's camp," or the radio replied. The voice in the static wasn't Dale's anymore. It was mine. It was the flat, dead recording of my own voice I had heard down in the ravine. "Something else out here. Silas, Silas, Silas." The radio began to repeat my name. Over and over, the speed increasing until it was a continuous, high-pitched whine like feedback from a microphone. I slammed the radio back onto its bracket, threw the truck into reverse, spun it around in the narrow road, and drove. I drove faster than was safe on those slick, muddy curves, the tires sliding on the wet gravel. the headlights catching the dark, looming walls of the forest on either side. I didn't go back to the patrol cabin. I drove straight to the ranger station in Trout Lake. When I burst through the door, wet, muddy, and pale, Dale was sitting at his desk, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the state of me. "Silas, what the hell happened to you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I sank into a chair, my hands still shaking. I told him everything. I told him about the tent, the stick figures, the footprints, the whistling, and the voices. I told him how it had used my voice and then his voice to try and get me to stop. Dale listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smile or shake his head in disbelief. He just sat there, his face growing grayer and more lined with every word I spoke. When I finished, he got up, closed the door to the office, and sat back down. He took a long drag from a cup of cold coffee, staring at the desk for what felt like an eternity before he looked up at me. "You didn't touch the sticks, did you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No," I said. "I didn't touch them." "What are they, Dale? What is out there?" Dale sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very soles of his boots. "The old-timers around here, the Yakima people, they have stories. They don't like to talk about that part of the forest. They call them the Steyahahma, the Stick Indians. But they aren't Indians, Silas. They aren't human. They're something else, something older than these mountains." He leaned forward, his eyes dead serious. "They don't hunt like wolves or bears. They don't stalk you to eat you. They hunt your mind. They twist your sense of direction. They make the trails look different. They mimic the voices of the people you know, the people you trust, to lure you off the path. Once you step off the trail to find the voice, you're gone. You walk and you walk thinking you're heading home, but you're just going deeper into the brush until you can't walk anymore. And then they build their little things out of you." "Their little things?" I whispered, my mind flashing back to the stick figures in Julian's tent. "The wood," Dale said softly. "They take your bones, Silas. They wrap them in cedar and hemlock. They make dolls out of them. They think it's a game. Or maybe it's a way of keeping you there. I don't know." "We have to go back for Julian," I said, though the very thought of returning to that ravine made my stomach turn. "The sheriff's team is going in tomorrow," Dale said, shaking his head. "But they won't find him. They never do. Not when the sticks are already laid out. We'll find his truck, maybe his gear if they decide to leave it. But Julian is part of the woods now." He was right. The search and rescue team went in the next morning. I refused to go with them, citing exhaustion and mild hypothermia. They found Julian's tent just as I had described it. But when they arrived, the tent was empty. The camera, the sleeping bag, and the backpack were all there. But there were no stick figures. No carved branches, no geometric patterns, no black stone. And there were no footprints in the sand. The creek had risen during the night, washing away any tracks that might have been left behind. The search lasted for 6 days. They used dogs, drones, and infrared cameras, but they found absolutely nothing. It was as if Julian Mercer had simply evaporated into the damp green air of the Cascade Mountains. I resigned from the Forest Service 3 days later. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I couldn't stand the sound of the wind through the trees, or the way the fog crept across the road. Every time I heard a bird whistle, my heart would jump into my throat. Every time someone spoke to me from behind, I would freeze, waiting for the words to repeat in that flat, dead, mechanical echo. Now, I live in Seattle. I have a job in a warehouse, a mindless, noisy job where the hum of machinery and the clatter of forklifts drowns out everything else. It's safe, it's loud, but sometimes when the city quietens down in the early hours of the morning, and the coastal fog rolls in off Puget Sound, swallowing the streetlights and turning the buildings into towering, dark silhouettes, I sit in my living room in the dark, and occasionally, through the double-paned glass of my window, 3 stories up, I hear it. It's faint, nearly drowned out by the distant rumble of the interstate, but it's there. A whistle. 2 notes. High, then a sharp drop, and then, in a voice that sounds exactly like my own, a whisper drifts through the glass. "Silas, come back. The woods are waiting." My name is Adam Smith. I am 38 years old. and for the past 12 years I have worked as a wilderness patrol ranger for the United States Forest Service. In the autumn of 2018, I was stationed in the eastern district of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, a sprawling ancient expanse of dense hardwood timber, jagged limestone ridges and deep isolated hollows where the shadows seem to settle early and leave late. I have spent my entire adult life in the woods, learning how to read the landscape, how to listen to the natural cadences of the backcountry, and how to survive the elements. I am not a superstitious man, nor am I easily rattled by the loneliness of a long solo tour, but the events that unfolded over 7 days in October of that year forced me to leave my post, abandon the career I loved, and move out of the mountains entirely. I am writing this down now because the silence of the city doesn't quite drown out the memories, and I feel a quiet, heavy obligation to leave a record of what happened before the details begin to blur. The autumn of 2018 was unusually wet and cold in the Allegheny Mountains. By mid-October, a persistent, low-hanging fog had settled over the ridges, smelling of damp loam, decaying oak leaves, and the sharp, metallic tang of impending frost. The sky was a continuous sheet of slate gray that never seemed to let the sun fully through, casting the entire forest in a muted, perpetual twilight. At the district ranger station near Petersburg, the air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp canvas. My supervisor, a gruff, lifelong mountaineer named Thomas Boyd, called me into his small, map-lined office on a Tuesday morning. He handed me a standard incident report clip and pointed to a remote, rugged section of the forest known locally as the Black Fork Backcountry. An elderly gentleman named Harrison Vance, a retired surveyor from Winchester, Virginia, had been reported missing by his family. He had gone into the Black Fork alone 5 days prior to photograph the fall foliage and old-growth hemlocks. He was meticulous, a creature of habit who always left a precise itinerary with his daughter, detailing exactly where he intended to hike and camp. According to his plans, he should have returned to his truck at the remote Red Creek trailhead by Sunday afternoon. When his vehicle was found yesterday evening, untouched and dusted with a fresh layer of hemlock needles, Thomas knew we had a real problem on our hands. The Black Fork is not a place where you want to be lost in late autumn. It is an unmanaged wilderness area, crisscrossed by old, abandoned logging grades from the early 20th century, deep bogs and steep, rocky ravines where a single misstep can leave you with a broken ankle 20 miles from the nearest paved road. I packed my standard 72-hour search and rescue gear into my internal frame pack, double-checking my emergency rations, my heavy-duty field flashlight, my cold-weather bivy sack, and my state-issued sidearm, a standard Sig Sauer .40 caliber pistol that I kept secured in a nylon holster on my hip. I didn't expect to use the firearm for anything more than a signaling device or protection against an unusually aggressive black bear, but regulations required us to carry when entering remote sectors alone. Thomas told me that a volunteer search team with tracking hounds would be entering from the Southern Gap by Wednesday morning, but he wanted me to do an immediate, preliminary sweep of the High Ridge Trail where Harrison Vance's itinerary indicated he would spend his first 2 nights. I drove my patrol truck up the narrow, twisting Forest Service roads, the gravel crunching loudly beneath the heavy tires as the elevation increased. The fog grew steadily thicker, swirling in pale, ghostly tendrils through the trunks of the black cherry and yellow birch trees. By the time I reached the Red Creek trailhead, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. The forest was utterly still, wrapped in a heavy, muffled quiet that made the sudden cut of my truck engine feel jarringly abrupt. Harrison Vance's silver Ford F-150 was parked in the small gravel turnout, exactly as reported. I walked over to it, checking the cab through the window. A small pile of maps lay on the passenger seat, along with an empty travel mug and a pair of reading glasses. There was nothing unusual, no sign of distress, just a lonely vehicle waiting for an owner who hadn't come back. I adjusted the straps of my heavy pack, clicked my trekking poles into position, and stepped onto the trail. The path immediately plunged into a dense stand of rhododendron thickets that grew so high and thick they formed a dark, vaulted tunnel over the dirt. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic thud-thud of my boots on the damp earth and the wet snip of my poles striking slick river rocks. The air was cold, stinging the back of my throat with each deep breath, smelling intensely of rotting wood and the mossy moisture of the deep hollows. As I climbed higher toward the ridge, the rhododendron gave way to massive, ancient eastern hemlocks, their dark, feathery boughs blocking out whatever pale light remained in the sky. By late afternoon, I had covered about 8 miles of steep, rugged terrain. The trail had become progressively harder to follow, frequently choked by massive blowdowns, huge, fallen trees that required me to either scramble over their slick, mossy trunks or force my way through the thick brush around them. I kept my eyes trained on the ground, looking for any sign of Harrison's passage. In a few patches of soft, dark mud near a small spring run, I found what I was looking for, the crisp, distinct imprint of a technical hiking boot, a Vibram sole pattern that matched the size and style his family had described. The tracks were a few days old, their edges slightly softened by the recent rain, but they showed he was moving steadily along the established route. Around 5 o'clock, the wind began to rise, whistling low and mournful through the high canopy of the hemlocks. The temperature plummeted rapidly, turning the damp fog into a fine, freezing drizzle that coated my jacket in a glistening sheen of ice. I knew I needed to find a suitable place to make camp before the darkness became absolute. In the Monongahela, when the night sets in under a heavy fog, the blackness is so dense it feels physical, almost heavy against your chest. I deviated slightly from the main ridge trail, dropping down into a small, sheltered bench about 100 yards below the crest, where a small clearing offered some protection from the biting wind. I set up my small, lightweight mountain tent, pulling the rainfly taut against the damp breeze. I didn't light a fire. The wood was too soaked to burn without a massive amount of effort, and I didn't want the smoke stinging my eyes in the tight space. Instead, I crawled into my tent, stripped off my damp outer shell, and ate a cold supper of beef jerky and hard cheese. The small battery-powered lantern hanging from the center loop of the tent cast a warm, yellow glow over my gear, creating a small sanctuary of safety against the immense, dark wilderness outside. I lay down on my sleeping pad, listening to the steady, rhythmic pat-pat-pat of the freezing drizzle against the nylon fabric. I felt tired but entirely at peace, confident that tomorrow I would find more clues that would lead us to the missing surveyor. I woke up suddenly at 3:14 a.m. My eyes didn't flutter open. They snapped wide, my body immediately rigid beneath my heavy sleeping bag. My heart was thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Every survival instinct I had honed over a decade in the woods was screaming at me to remain perfectly still. I lay there in the pitch darkness of the tent, having turned off the lantern before falling asleep, listening with an intensity that made my ears ring. The freezing drizzle had stopped. The wind had died down to an absolute dead calm. The silence that had settled over the high ridge was profound, so total that I could hear the tiny, rhythmic tick of the watch on my wrist and the dry sound of my own eyelashes blinking against the fabric of my camping pillow. But it wasn't the silence that had woken me. It was something else. From somewhere outside the tent, perhaps 30 yards away down the slope of the bench, came a sound. It was a dull, heavy thump, followed by a long, deliberate pause. Then another thump. It sounded like something immensely heavy was dropping onto the soft, wet earth of the forest floor. It wasn't the sharp, clicking tread of a white-tailed deer, nor was it the heavy, rolling shuffle of a black bear. There was a distinct two-legged cadence to the movement, a slow, dragging weight that seemed to move with a strange, deliberate rhythm. Thump, drag, thump, drag. I carefully slid my right hand out of the warm sleeping bag, my fingers tracking along the cold floor of the tent until they brushed against the rough, checkered nylon grip of my holster. I unclipped the retaining strap with a slow, agonizingly cautious movement, ensuring the metal snap didn't make a sound. I pulled the Sig Sauer free, the weight of the steel reassuring in my hand. I didn't chamber around. There was already one in the pipe, and the loud clack of the slide would have been an unmistakable declaration of my presence to whatever was outside. The sounds were coming closer. They were moving up the slope from the deep hollow, heading directly toward the small clearing where my tent was pitched. The cadence never changed, that slow, heavy, dragging step that sounded as if something massive was pulling itself forward through the brush. As it drew nearer, I realized I couldn't hear the branches breaking. In a forest as choked with fallen timber and dead laurel as the Black Fork, anything that size should have been crashing through the undergrowth like a bulldozer. But this thing moved with a terrifying fluid quietness, the only sound being the heavy, dead impact of its weight against the ground. Then the air inside the tent changed. The smell hit me first. It didn't drift in slowly. It seemed to materialize through the nylon fabric all at once. A thick, greasy reek that made my stomach tighten with an immediate, physical surge of nausea. It smelled like a root cellar that had been flooded with stagnant river water and left to rot for 20 years. A combination of wet dog hair, sour mud, and a faint, sweet copper undertone of ancient decay. It was so potent that my eyes began to water in the dark, and I had to breathe through my mouth. My teeth clenched to keep from gagging. The heavy footsteps stopped exactly outside the rear wall of my tent. I was sitting up now, frozen in a half-crouch, holding the pistol with both hands, pointing it toward the thin green nylon structure that separated me from the dark. The thing was standing less than 3 feet from where my head had been resting. I could hear it. It wasn't breathing, not like an animal breathes, with a steady rhythmic intake of air, but rather, it was making a low, resonant, vibrating sound deep within itself, a sound that felt less like an acoustic noise and more like a mechanical hum that vibrated through the damp ground and up through my sleeping pad. Then, a voice came out of the darkness. It didn't shout. It spoke in a low, flat, entirely uninflected monotone that carried a strange artificial quality, like a voice recorded on an old, degraded magnetic tape. The tone was completely dead, devoid of any human emotion, running the words together without any natural pause or emphasis. "Is anyone there? I am lost. My name is Harrison. My camera is broken. Please help me." The words themselves were a desperate plea for help, but the delivery was chillingly hollow. It sounded like someone who didn't speak English trying to read a phonetic script from a language they didn't understand. It repeated the phrase, exactly the same way, using the exact same dead cadence 3 times. "Is anyone there? I am lost. My name is Harrison. My camera is broken. Please help me. Is anyone there? I am lost. My name is Harrison." I sat there, paralyzed by a cold, primordial fear that seemed to lock up my joints. Every professional instinct I possessed told me that there was a missing man outside my tent, an elderly surveyor who was freezing and confused. But the rational human core of my brain was screaming that what was standing 3 feet away was not a man. No human voice could sound that completely mechanical, that utterly detached from the terror of being lost in a dark wilderness. And no human could produce that foul, suffocating stench of ancient rot. I held my breath, my finger resting lightly against the cold steel of the trigger, waiting for the fabric of the tent to give way, for a hand or a claw to tear through the thin material. The silence outside returned, save for that low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the small bones in my ears. After what felt like hours, the thing began to move again. It didn't walk past the tent. Instead, it turned back toward the steep slope of the hollow, its heavy, dragging footsteps slowly retreating down into the darkness. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The voice continued to drift back through the trees, growing gradually fainter but never changing its flat, mechanical rhythm, until the sound was finally swallowed by the vast, empty distance of the canyon below. "Is anyone there? I am lost. My name is Harrison." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in that exact position, my back against the tent pole, the gun held tightly in my hands, staring at the green wall until the dark charcoal of the night slowly softened into the cold, slate gray of a mountain morning. When the light was sufficient to see by, I cautiously unzipped the tent door. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to slide the zipper up. The forest outside looked exactly as it had the previous evening, shrouded in gray fog, dripping with moisture, silent and indifferent. I stepped out onto the damp earth, keeping my pistol held flat against my thigh. I walked around to the back of the tent where the thing had been standing. The ground there was covered in a thick layer of wet, rotting birch leaves. There were no footprints, no boot marks, no animal paws. Instead, there were 2 deep, elongated depressions in the soft mud, about 16 inches long and 6 inches wide, completely smooth as if a pair of heavy, rounded logs had been pressed into the earth with immense structural force. The leaves inside the depressions had been crushed into a dark, greasy paste. And there, sitting directly in the center of one of the marks, was a small black object. I knelt down, my breath pluming out in short, ragged clouds, and picked it up. It was a plastic lens cap from a Nikon camera, its surface scratched and covered in a thin layer of that foul-smelling sour slime I had detected during the night. scratched into the plastic on the back with what looked like a pin, where the letters H.V. Harrison Vance had been right here. He had been right where those heavy, featureless marks were pressed into the mud. I stood up, my mind racing, a cold dread settling deep into my gut. The logic of a standard search and rescue operation had completely broken down. I pulled my field radio from my belt, switched it to the emergency tactical frequency, and keyed the microphone. Petersburg Station, this is Ranger Smith on Sector 3. Thomas, do you copy? Over. The radio responded with a sharp, piercing blast of static that made me wince and pull the unit away from my ear. I adjusted the squelch and tried again. Petersburg, this is Smith. I have found evidence of the subject's gear on the High Ridge bench. I need a status update on the Southern search team. Do you copy? Nothing but that flat, rushing white noise. It didn't sound like a standard dead zone caused by the terrain. It felt heavy, thick, as if something was actively holding down a transmission key on a powerful transmitter somewhere nearby, completely jamming the frequency with an empty, roaring hiss. I clipped the radio back to my belt, realizing with a sudden, sinking feeling that I was entirely on my own. Protocol dictated that if I found physical evidence of a missing person, but was unable to establish communication, and if there was a potential hazard in the area, I should immediately retreat to the trailhead to coordinate with the incoming search teams. That was the rational path. But as I looked at the lens cap in my hand, a deep, stubborn anger began to cut through my fear. Harrison Vance was a grandfather, a retired surveyor who had come to these mountains to see the autumn colors, and something was out here using his name, using his voice like a crude mechanical lure. I decided to follow the direction the tracks had taken down into the hollow. I packed up my tent with frantic, uncoordinated movements, not bothering to roll it properly, simply stuffing the wet nylon into the bottom of my pack. I hoisted the heavy load, verified that my sidearm was secure but easily accessible, and began my descent into the Black Fork Canyon. The slope was incredibly steep, a treacherous field of loose limestone talus and rotten logs hidden beneath a deceptive layer of slick, wet leaves. The fog in the hollow was even denser than on the ridge, a thick white milk that reduced my world to a radius of 20 feet around my body. The air down here was stagnant, freezing, and heavy with that persistent smell of old dampness and rot. As I moved deeper into the canyon, the forest grew stranger. The trees here were deformed, their trunks twisted into unnatural spiraling shapes as if they had been wrenched by some immense force while they were young. Many of the ancient hemlocks were dead, standing like giant gray skeletons in the fog, their bark peeled away in long, vertical strips. The absolute absence of wildlife was striking. In 12 years of forestry work, I had never encountered a section of wood so completely devoid of life. There were no squirrels, no chipmunks, no birds flitting through the branches. The only sound was the cold, wet drip of condensation from the dead limbs onto the forest floor. Drip, drip, drip. By midday, I reached the bottom of the hollow where a wide, sluggish creek snaked its way through a series of dark peat bogs. The water was black as ink, stained by the tannins of the rotting vegetation, its surface completely flat without a single ripple. I followed the edge of the bog looking for any sign of movement or passage. Near a large, overhanging limestone ledge that formed a natural shallow cave against the canyon wall, I found Harrison's camera bag. It was an old, olive-drab canvas shoulder bag lying open in the damp moss. I approached it slowly, my boots sinking into the soft peat with a wet sucking sound. I knelt down and examined the contents. The bag had been handled with a strange, systematic violence. The metal buckles hadn't been unclipped. They had been torn completely out of the canvas fabric. Inside, Harrison's expensive DSLR camera was entirely shattered. The heavy metal body had been twisted and bent as if it were nothing more than soft tin, the glass elements of the lens crushed into a fine, glittering powder that lay scattered across the moss like salt. Beside the ruined camera lay his field notebook. It was a simple spiral-bound pad used for keeping logs of his locations and camera settings. I picked it up, the damp paper tearing slightly under my fingers. The first dozen pages contained neat, precise notes written in a steady, elderly hand, dates, lens selections, coordinates, and brief descriptions of the old-growth trees he had found. But on the final page, the writing changed. The lines were no longer straight. The letters were huge, chaotic, scrawled across the paper with a desperate, frantic energy that had torn the page in several places. There were no full sentences, just a repeating sequence of single words, written over and over again until the ink ran out. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't breathe. It uses my name. It uses my name. The final line at the bottom of the page was written in a tiny, trembling script that was barely legible. It's waiting for me to stop talking so it can finish the sound. A sharp, icy shudder ran down my spine. I dropped the notebook back into the canvas bag, my heart hammering against my ribs once more. I stood up quickly, turning my back to the limestone wall, sweeping my eyes across the white wall of the fog that surrounded me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I were standing in the middle of an open field during a lightning storm. Then, from the darkness further down the creek bed, where the channel narrowed into a steep rocky flume, I heard a sound. It wasn't a footstep. It was a wet, heavy splash followed by that same low, mechanical clicking noise I had heard elements of during the night. Click, click, click. It sounded like someone snapping two heavy pieces of dry bone together, over and over with a rapid, rhythmic precision. I drew my pistol, holding it out in a classic two-handed stance, my breathing shallow and fast. "U.S. Forest Service Ranger," I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the heavy silence of the canyon. "Identify yourself. If you are in need of assistance, stay where you are." The clicking stopped instantly. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. I waited, my muscles cramping from the tension, the heavy weight of my backpack pulling at my shoulders. Then the voice came back. But it didn't come from the direction of the creek bed. It came from directly above me, from the high, foggy rim of the limestone ledge that overhung the bog where I was standing. And it wasn't Harrison Vance's voice this time. It was my voice. "Petersburg Station, this is Ranger Smith on Sector 3. Thomas, do you copy?" "Petersburg, this is Smith. I have found evidence." It was an identical, terrifyingly precise acoustic reproduction of my radio transmission from 5 hours ago. The pitch, the gravelly tone of my voice, even the subtle, sharp hiss of the radio static between my words. The thing had recorded the entire soundscape and was playing it back into the fog with a flat, mechanical clarity that made my mind tilt with an absolute, unreasoning panic. "Identify yourself." My own voice shouted back at me from the high rocks, using the exact words I had spoken only moments before. "Identify yourself, if you are in need of assistance." I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about Harrison Vance or the search teams or my duty as an officer of the law. The absolute certainty that I was being hunted by something that possessed no humanity, something that was learning my identity piece by piece, broke whatever professional resolve I had left. I turned and began to scramble up the opposite slope of the canyon, desperate to get out of the dark hollow and back to the relative safety of the high ridge trail. The climb was a nightmare. The terrain was incredibly steep, a chaotic jumble of slick shale and thick briars that tore at my uniform trousers and scratched my face. My breath came in short, burning gasps, my lungs aching from the cold, damp air. I didn't look back, but I could hear it behind me. It was descending the limestone ledge, its heavy, dragging weight hitting the ground with those dull, dead impacts. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It was moving up the slope behind me with a terrifying, effortless speed, never crashing through the brush, never slipping on the loose stone, a dark, heavy mass cutting through the fog like a knife through milk. By the time I tumbled out onto the narrow tread of the main ridge trail, the pale slate gray of the daytime sky was already beginning to deepen into the dark charcoal of twilight. The fog had rolled over the crest of the mountain, reducing my visibility to less than 10 feet. I was exhausted, my legs trembling from the immense exertion, my uniform soaked with sweat and freezing drizzle. I knew I couldn't make it back to the trailhead before midnight. The trail through the high hemlock groves was too dangerous to navigate in the dark without a flashlight, and using a light would be like lighting a flare in an open field, signaling my exact position to the thing that was tracking me. I had to make camp again. The thought filled me with a cold, hollow dread, but survival logic left me with no alternative. I left the trail, pushing through a dense, dark stand of young spruce trees that grew so close together. Their branches formed a thick, prickly barrier, In the center of the grove, I found a small circular opening where the ground was covered in a thick carpet of dry spruce needles. I didn't set up my tent this time. I didn't want to be trapped inside a nylon box where I couldn't see what was coming. Instead, I pulled my heavy bivy sack out of my pack, unrolled it directly on the ground against the solid trunk of a massive ancient hemlock, and crawled inside with all my clothes on. I kept my pistol held firmly in my right hand, my finger resting alongside the frame, the cold steel pressed against my ribs. I didn't light a light. I didn't move. I just lay there in the deepening blackness, staring at the small V-shaped opening between the spruce branches above me. The night was long, cold, and agonizingly quiet. The freezing drizzle returned around midnight, a fine, icy mist that hissed softly as it struck the needles of the spruce trees. The air inside my bivy sack grew freezing, my breath condensing into a layer of frost around the collar of my jacket. I kept my eyes wide, staring into the dark, my ears strained to their absolute limit. Around 2:45 a.m., the smell returned. It was stronger than before, a thick, oily stench of stagnant mud and rot that seemed to settle over the small clearing like a heavy blanket. The air became thick, hard to breathe, carrying that sweet copper undertone of ancient decay that made my gorge rise. Then came the footsteps. They didn't approach from the trail. They came from the thickest part of the spruce grove, the heavy, dead impacts of its weight crushing the wet moss with that slow, deliberate rhythm. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The branches of the young spruce trees didn't snap or rustle as it passed through them. They simply seemed to part silently, as if the thing was shifting the geometry of the forest around itself as it moved. It stopped exactly at the edge of my small clearing, less than 10 feet from where I lay wrapped in my bivy sack. The silence that followed was absolute. The soft hiss of the freezing drizzle seemed to fade into the background, replaced by that low, resonant mechanical hum that vibrated through the trunk of the massive hemlock against my back. I lay perfectly still, my jaw clamped shut so tightly my teeth ached, my eyes wide and straining to catch any shift in the deep blackness of the clearing. Through the narrow opening between the spruce branches, a shape began to manifest in the dark. The smoky gray light of the night sky, filtered through the thick fog, caught the outline of the entity. It was tall, monstrously tall, its upper torso disappearing into the low branches of the canopy, perhaps 8 or 9 feet in height. Its proportions were completely wrong, a skeletal, elongated frame that looked like a winter birch tree that had been stripped of its bark and stained with dark river mud. Its limbs were thin, impossibly long, its arms hanging down past its knees like heavy, dangling ropes. Its skin had a dull, matte texture that seemed to actively absorb the pale light, a surface that looked like old, wet leather that had been buried in a bog for a century. But it was the head that made the breath freeze in my throat. The neck was long and thin, bent forward at an extreme, unnatural angle so that its head hung low, near the center of its chest. The head itself was a smooth, featureless wedge of that dark deadwood skin. There were no eyes, no nose, no ears. There was only a wide, horizontal split across the bottom of the wedge, a dark, lipless cavity that opened and closed with a slow, wet movement. Inside the cavity, there were no teeth, no tongue, just a series of pale, glistening membranes that vibrated rapidly as it began to speak. And when it spoke, it didn't use Harrison's voice. It didn't use my voice from the radio transmission. It used my voice, but it was speaking to me in the present tense. Adam, it murmured into the dark. The sound was perfect. It was an absolute, flawless duplication of my own voice, carrying the exact cadence, the exact regional inflection of my upbringing in Northern Virginia, even the specific, breathy quality of my speech when I am frightened or exhausted. It was as if I were standing outside my own body, listening to myself speak from the darkness of the trees. Adam, you left your notebook in the bag, my voice whispered from the lipless cavity. The search team isn't coming to the ridge. The radio is dead. Come out of the bag, Adam, it's cold in the rocks. I pressed my back against the solid wood of the hemlock tree until my spine hurt, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the Sig Sauer with both hands beneath the fabric of the bivy sack. I aligned the night sights with the smooth, pale wedge of its head through the spruce branches. the 3 green dots dancing wildly in the dark as my hand shook with an uncontrollable, primitive terror. I knew that if I fired, the muzzle flash would blind me in the tight space, and if the bullets didn't drop it instantly, I would be entirely at its mercy before I could clear the bag. The entity didn't advance into the clearing. It stood perfectly still at the edge of the spruce trees, its long skeletal head tilting from side to side with a slow, mechanical rhythm, as if it were sniffing the freezing air or listening to the frantic, rapid thumping of my heart against my ribs. The foul stench of rot grew so intense that I had to bite down on my own tongue to keep from vomiting, the taste of copper filling my mouth. "I can hear your watch ticking, Adam," my own voice said from the dark, the tone entirely flat, mechanical, and dead. "You sound so tired. Just stop talking so we can finish the sound." The phrase from Harrison Vance's notebook flashed through my mind with a sudden, blinding clarity. It's waiting for me to stop talking so it can finish the sound. The thing didn't just mimic voices. It collected them, stealing the acoustic identity of the people who wandered into its territory, using their language like a tool it had found, but didn't truly understand. It was waiting for me to break, to scream, to speak back to it, so it could capture the final, authentic cadence of my terror. I clamped my mouth shut, holding my breath until my chest felt like it was going to split open, my eyes locked on the 3 green dots of my gun sights. I resolved in that moment that I would not speak. I would not make a sound. If it came for me, I would pull the trigger until the magazine was empty, but I would die in absolute silence. The thing remained in that position for what felt like an eternity, a long, agonizing hour of absolute stillness where the only movement was the wet, slow opening and closing of that dark cavity on its chest. Then, around 4 in the morning, with a sudden sharp click of its inner membranes, the entity turned. It didn't walk away. It simply receded backward into the thick fog and the dense spruce trees, its heavy, dragging footsteps slowly fading out as it climbed back toward the jagged crest of the high ridge. Thump, drag, thump, drag. My own voice drifted back through the trees, growing steadily fainter, repeating my name over and over again until the sound was nothing more than the cold wind whistling through the dead hemlock boughs. Adam, Adam, Adam. I didn't move until the slate-gray light of the morning had completely filled the small clearing, burning off the thickest part of the fog. I didn't pack my gear. I left my pack, my bivy sack, my rations, and my maps lying in the dirt beneath the spruce trees. I scrambled out of the grove, my pistol still held tightly in my right hand, and I hit the ridge trail running. I ran for 9 miles. I ran through the dark hemlock tunnels, over the slick blowdowns, and down the treacherous rocky switchbacks, my boots slamming into the earth with a frantic, desperate rhythm. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to rest. Every time the wind whistled through the trees behind me, I felt a surge of absolute panic that drove my legs forward with an unnatural, terrified energy. When I finally burst out into the gravel turnout at the Red Creek trailhead, the midday sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting a pale, washed-out light over the vehicles. Harrison Vance's silver truck was still there, lonely and untouched. My patrol truck sat 40 feet away, a familiar, solid sanctuary of steel and glass. I scrambled inside, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine, the loud roar of the motor feeling like the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I drove down the mountain service roads at a breakneck pace, the tires screaming on the loose gravel as I negotiated the sharp switchbacks. When I reached the Petersburg station, I walked past the front desk without speaking to anyone, went into the locker room and stood over the sink for 10 minutes, washing the gray mountain mud from my hands and face. My reflection in the mirror looked hollow, pale, the eyes wide and shadowed by a permanent deep-seated dread. I walked into Thomas Boyd's office and laid my state-issued sidearm and my badge on his desk. He looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face tightening as he took in my torn uniform, my scratched face, and the cold, flat stare in my eyes. "Adam," he said, his voice low and concerned. "What happened out there?" "Did you find Vance?" "I found his gear," I said, my voice sounding flat and distant even to myself. "Near the Black Fork Bog. Cameras destroyed. Notebooks there. It looks like an animal attack. He's gone, Thomas." "What about the Southern Search Team?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. "Did you make radio contact?" "The radio's dead," I said. "The whole sector's dead. I'm done, Thomas. I'm resigning. Effective immediately. He tried to talk to me, tried to ask more questions, to tell me that I was in shock, that I needed to see a doctor. But I didn't listen. I walked out of the station, got into my personal vehicle, and drove away from the Monongahela National Forest before the sun could set behind the ridges. The search for Harrison Vance continued for another week. They found my abandoned camp, my gear, and they found his canvas bag near the limestone ledge. The official report stated that he had likely succumbed to hypothermia and disorientation, his remains scattered by regional predators. The volunteer searchers reported that their tracking hounds refused to enter the Black Fork Canyon, howling and biting at their leashes until they were dragged back to the ridge. I live in Ohio now, in a small, flat farming community where the horizon stretches out for miles in every direction and the cornfields replace the trees. There are no mountains here, no ancient dark hemlocks, no deep foggy hollows where the shadows can grow too long. I work as a code enforcement officer for the county, a quiet, mundane job that keeps me on paved roads and inside air-conditioned offices. But the silence doesn't sleep. Every few weeks, usually in the dead of winter when the ground is frozen hard and the wind hums low around the eaves of my house, I wake up precisely at 2:45 a.m. I sit up in bed, my skin cold with sweat, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I look out the window into the empty, snow-covered yard beneath the streetlights, and sometimes just on the absolute edge of my hearing, drifting across the flat, open fields, I can hear a sound. It's my own voice, and it's calling me back to the woods. My name is Michael Vance. I am 34 years old, and for the last 7 years I have worked as a backcountry law enforcement ranger for the National Park Service. In the late summer of 2021, I was stationed in the northern district of Idaho's Clearwater National Forest, a brutal, stunningly beautiful expanse of jagged ridges, ancient cedar groves, and deep, suffocating canyons, where the modern world feels entirely irrelevant. I am writing this now not out of a desire for notoriety, but because the silence in my own head has become louder than any noise I can make on paper. When you work in the high country, you learn to live with a certain amount of isolation. You learn that the wind through the pines isn't talking to you, and that the shadows stretching across the scree slopes at twilight are just geometry. But what happened over a 6-day period in August of that year stripped away every comfortable, rational layer of training I possessed, leaving me with a cold, permanent dread that I cannot shake, no matter how far I run from the trees. The district office in Orofino was quiet that Tuesday morning, when my supervisor, a weathered, cynical veteran named Arthur Vance, no relation, just a coincidence of regional lineage, handed me a slim manila folder. The air conditioning in the old brick building was humming a low, rattling tune that failed to compete with the 90-degree heat blooming outside. Arthur didn't look up from his paperwork as he pushed the file across the scarred oak desk. He told me that a solo backpacker, a 26-year-old graduate student from the University of Montana named David Miller, had failed to check out of his entry point at the 4th of July trailhead 3 days prior. David was an experienced hiker, a kid who kept detailed logs and didn't stray from designated routes, which made his absence troubling. His vehicle, a dusty blue Subaru Outback, was still parked at the trailhead untouched. I took the file, nodding, expecting the usual protocol, a standard 3-day wilderness sweep, a call out to the local search and rescue volunteers with their tracking hounds, and maybe an afternoon helicopter flyover if the smoke from the regional wildfires didn't drop the visibility too low. I packed my standard 72-hour patrol kit into my Mystery Ranch pack, checked my service sidearm, a standard-issue Glock 22, and drove my patrol truck up the winding, gravel service roads that cut into the bitter heart of the Clearwater Mountains. The air grew progressively thicker with each mile of elevation, tainted by a thin, ghostly haze of high-altitude smoke that turned the afternoon sun into a dull copper coin hanging in a pale violet sky. The smell of scorched pine and dry dust was heavy, settling in the back of my throat like ash. When I reached the trailhead, the isolation hit me with its usual physical force. There was no one around for 20 miles in any direction. The Subaru sat lonely under the shade of a massive Douglas fir, its windshield coated in a fine layer of yellow pollen. I got out of my truck, the door slamming with a sharp metallic crack that seemed to be instantly swallowed by the immense heavy silence of the forest. I checked the trail register. David's signature was there, neat and precise. Dated August 11th. His destination was listed as the upper basin near a series of unnamed, glacier-fed tarns tucked beneath the shadow of a jagged formation known locally as the Deadman's Teeth. It was a rugged, 18-mile trek through dense timber and steep switchbacks, a place where the radio reception was non-existent and the terrain was a labyrinth of fallen logs and slick shale. I began my hike at 1 in the afternoon. For the first few hours, everything felt perfectly normal, if exceptionally dry. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the hard-packed dirt and the occasional sharp clack of my trekking poles hitting loose stones. The forest here was old, grand, and dark. Giant western red cedars, some 10 feet wide at the base, blocked out most of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor where only ferns and thick moss could survive. The air was cool and damp beneath the canopy, smelling of decay and wet earth, a stark contrast to the heat of the open ridges. By 5 o'clock, I had climbed out of the cedar bottoms and entered a high, narrow valley where the trees thinned into lodgepole pines and subalpine firs. It was here that the first subtle shift in the environment occurred. The standard background noise of the Clearwater, the persistent chattering scold of Douglas squirrels, the high-pitched whistle of marmots in the rocks, the distant, comforting murmur of running water, simply evaporated. The silence didn't feel like the absence of sound. It felt like a presence, something heavy and deliberate that had settled over the valley, compressing the air. I stopped to take a drink from my Nalgene, and the sound of my own swallowing felt obscurely loud, almost profane in the stillness. I checked the ground for tracks. The trail was dry and brittle, making footprint identification difficult, but occasionally I would see the faint, sharp crescent of a vibrant boot heel in a patch of dust. David's trail. He was moving at a good pace, his stride consistent. I kept walking, wanting to make the high basin before the light failed entirely. As the sun dipped behind the western ridges, the copper haze in the sky turned a deep, bruised charcoal. The temperature dropped rapidly, the mountain air taking on a sharp, biting edge. I reached the lower edge of the basin around 7:30. It was a desolate, amphitheater-like space, bounded on 3 sides by towering walls of gray granite that rose hundreds of feet into the sky. The Deadman's Teeth jaggedly pierced the horizon above me, looking like the broken jaw of some ancient buried beast. In the center of the basin lay the first tarn, its water so still and dark it looked like a sheet of polished obsidian reflecting the dying, smoky light. I scanned the shoreline for any sign of a camp. There was nothing. No tent, no smoke, no human debris. I decided to make my own camp on a small flat bench of granite 50 yards above the water, tucked against a cluster of stunted Krumholtz pines that offered some protection from the night wind. I set up my small green mountain tent, boiled some water on my lightweight stove, and ate a simple meal of dehydrated beef stew. The small blue flame of the stove made a comforting, roaring sound, but when I snapped it off, the silence returned, thicker than before. It was during that first night that the logic of the world began to warp. I woke up precisely at 2:14 a.m. I didn't wake up gradually. My eyes simply snapped open, my heart hammering against my ribs in the absolute darkness of the tent. Every muscle in my body was tight, responding to some primal cue that my conscious mind hadn't yet processed. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. The wind had died down completely. The air inside the tent was freezing, my breath pluming out in pale, invisible clouds that I could feel against my face. Then from the direction of the lake below came a sound. It was a footstep. It wasn't the light, careless step of a deer or the heavy, scraping tread of a black bear. It was a heavy, deliberate, 2-legged step. Crunch. A long pause, perhaps 10 seconds. Then another. Crunch. I reached out through the fabric of my sleeping bag and wrapped my fingers around the cold, textured grip of my Glock. The metal was icy against my skin. I slid the safety off, the tiny click sounding like a gunshot in the enclosure of the nylon tent. I sat up slowly, trying to minimize the rustle of my gear. The footsteps were moving along the gravel shoreline of the tarn, about 50 yards away. They were slow, almost rhythmic, but there was an odd cadence to them, a slight dragging sound at the end of each stride, as if whoever or whatever was walking was pulling something heavy behind them, or moving with a profound structural deformity. I unzipped the tent door an inch at a time, the teeth of the zipper biting into the silence with an agonizingly slow rasp. I pressed my eye to the narrow opening. The sky above was clear now, the smoke having drifted east, and the stars were brilliant icy points of light casting a faint silvery luminescence over the basin. The lake was a mirror of black ice. I looked toward the sound. The shoreline was a strip of pale gray granite gravel. At first I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted to the trickery of the starlight. There was a shape moving along the water's edge. It was tall, abnormally tall, perhaps 7 or 8 feet. But its proportions were wrong in a way that made my stomach turn with an immediate physical nausea. It was slender, almost skeletal, its limbs long and thin like the branches of a winter birch. It didn't wear clothes, but its skin wasn't bare. It had a dull, matte quality that seemed to absorb the starlight rather than reflect it, a texture that reminded me of wet, rotting wood or old leather that had been buried in the earth for a generation. It moved with a jerky, uncoordinated gait, its torso tilting forward at an extreme angle, its long arms hanging down past its knees. But it wasn't the shape that froze the blood in my veins. It was what it was doing. As it walked, it was mimicking a human voice. It wasn't shouting or crying out. It was speaking in a flat, monotone murmur, the words run together without inflection or pause. I strained my ears, pressing my head against the cold nylon of the tent. The voice was clear, carrying across the still water of the basin with a terrifying, crystalline precision. "Help me, I am lost near the lake. My name is David. My leg is broken. Please help me. I am lost near the lake. My name is David." The voice belonged to a young man. It was full of a strange, artificial terror. The words themselves were desperate, but the delivery was entirely dead, like a phonograph needle stuck in a groove, repeating a phrase it didn't understand. It was a perfect, chilling imitation of a human in distress, delivered by something that possessed no humanity whatsoever. I sat there paralyzed, my hand shaking so violently the barrel of the gun knocked softly against my knee. Every instinct I had as a ranger told me to throw open the tent, shine my high-lumen Surefire flashlight into the dark, and command the entity to stop. But a deeper, older instinct, the instinct that keeps animals quiet in the brush when a predator passes, slammed its weight against my chest, pinning me to the ground. That wasn't a man. That wasn't David Miller. The thing continued its slow, dragging march around the perimeter of the tarn. It repeated the phrase dozens of times, its voice never rising or falling in pitch. An endless mechanical loop that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath my sleeping pad. It walked until it reached the far side of the basin, where the granite wall rose vertically into the night. And then, without slowing down, the voice simply began to fade out, not as if it were moving away into the distance, but as if it were sinking into the rock itself. The words grew fainter, muffled, as though spoken through a thick blanket, until finally, around 4 in the morning, there was only the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the darkness, the gun held in both hands between my knees, staring at the zipped door of my tent until the sky outside turned from black to a cold, slate gray, when the sun finally hit the high peaks. Painting the dead man's teeth in a harsh, yellow light, I forced myself out of the tent. My joints were stiff from the cold and the tension. The basin looked beautiful, serene, and entirely devoid of malice. The tarn was a clear, deep blue now, ripples catching the morning breeze. I grabbed my pack and walked down to the shoreline where I had seen the shape. My heart was thumping a heavy, dull rhythm in my chest. I found the patch of gravel. There were no human footprints there. Instead, there were deep, elongated depressions in the loose stones, about 14 inches long, smooth and featureless, as if someone had pressed a heavy, rounded log into the dirt with immense force. Between each pair of tracks there was a faint, continuous line where something had dragged through the pebbles. Beside one of these depressions, half submerged in the freezing water of the lake, was a bright red object. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I reached into the water to retrieve it. It was a water filter, a standard MSR pump model. Its plastic casing cracked down the center, scratched into the side with a pocket knife where the initials DM David had been here. He had been right here where that thing had walked. I stood up, looking up at the massive granite wall surrounding the basin. There were no trails up there, no ledge systems that a human could navigate without technical climbing gear and ropes. Yet the voice had faded out directly against the rock face. I pulled my radio from my belt, switched it to the high-power tactical channel, and keyed the mic. "Orofino District, this is Ranger Vance on Sector 4. Do you copy?" Nothing but static. A harsh, empty rush of white noise that seemed to mock my attempt at contact. The mineral composition of these ridges often interfered with radio signals, but today the static felt heavier, almost deliberate, like someone was holding down a transmission button on the other end, blocking the frequency. I was alone. Protocol dictated that if I found evidence of a subject's gear but no sign of the subject, and if communication was down, I was to return to the trailhead to establish a base of operations and call in a full-scale recovery team. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. But as I looked at the cracked water filter in my hand, a deep, irrational anger began to mix with my fear. David Miller had come out here for a week of peace in the mountains, and something had hunted him. Something was using his voice like a hunter uses a duck call. I decided to search the immediate perimeter of the basin before turning back. I packed up my camp, hoisted my heavy pack, and began to work my way around the base of the granite cliffs looking for any cave, crevice, or slide area where a man could hide or be hidden. The hours dragged on. The heat returned, thick and oppressive, the mountain air growing heavy with the smell of dry pine needles and ozone. By 2 in the afternoon, I had circled nearly the entire basin. The terrain was brutal, huge boulder fields where every step required balance and concentration, interspersed with dense thickets of mountain mahogany that tore at my uniform trousers. Near the southeastern corner of the cliffs, where the rock face was permanently shadowed by a massive overhang, I found it. It wasn't a cave exactly, but a deep, narrow fissure in the granite, barely 3 feet wide, extending back into the darkness of the mountain. The air blowing out of the crack was freezing, carrying a smell that made me instantly stop and cover my nose with the collar of my shirt. It was the smell of a root cellar that had been closed for 50 years. Damp earth, wet fur, and a faint, sweet undertone of rot that was unmistakable to anyone who has ever spent time recovering bodies in the wilderness. I unclipped my flashlight, holding it forward in my left hand while my right hand rested on the grip of my sidearm. I clicked the beam on. The bright white light cut through the gloom of the fissure, revealing smooth, water-worn stone walls that angled sharply downward into the earth. The floor of the crevice was covered in a thick layer of fine, gray dust, and there, clearly visible in the dust, were the tracks. They were the same elongated, featureless depressions I had seen on the lakeshore, leading directly into the mountain, but alongside them were other marks, frantic, chaotic scuffs in the dirt, the unmistakable signs of a pair of hiking boots being dragged backward, the toes scraping 2 deep furrows through the dust. I squeezed my body into the fissure, the cold stone pressing against my chest and back. The space was tight, suffocatingly so, and the air grew heavier with that sickening sweet smell with every step I took. I walked about 20 yards into the mountain before the passage widened into a small, low-ceilinged chamber. The roof was so low I had to drop to my knees. I swept the flashlight beam across the room. The light hit a pile of clothing in the corner. I crawled toward it, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. It was David Miller's gear. His backpack was there, its straps neatly severed as if cut with an incredibly sharp knife. His tent was rolled up, never used. His sleeping bag was still stuffed in its compression sack. But it was his clothes that made my heart stop. His hiking shirt and trousers were there, discarded in a neat pile, but they hadn't been unbuttoned or unzipped. They had been torn open down the back, the fabric shredded into long, neat ribbons as if whatever had removed them had done so with immense, clinical precision, peeling them away from his body. There was no blood on the clothes. None at all. Just a pale, greasy residue that smelled faintly of old tallow. Then, from the darkness further back in the chamber, where the fissure narrowed down to a hole no larger than a fox den, I heard a sound. It was a wet clicking noise, like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click, click. I froze on my hands and knees, the flashlight beam trembling violently as I pointed it toward the hole. The light penetrated about 6 feet into the small tunnel before the rock turned a sharp corner. The clicking stopped. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then the voice returned. It didn't come from the hole. It seemed to rise up from the very stone beneath my knees, a low, resonant vibration that shook the fillings in my teeth. But it wasn't David's voice this time, it was my voice. Orofino District, this is Ranger Vance on Sector 4, do you copy? Orofino District, this is Ranger Vance. It was my exact tone, my exact inflection. Even the slight gravelly rasp I get in my throat when I haven't drank enough water. It was an identical acoustic photocopy of my transmission from 5 hours ago. The thing was sitting in the dark, inches away from me behind that rock turn, practicing my voice. A cold, primal terror, absolute and unreasoning, took hold of me. I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about David Miller. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, skinning my knuckles against the sharp granite floor, dropping my flashlight as I went. The light rolled into a depression, its beam pointing toward the ceiling, illuminating the low rocks in a harsh, ghostly glare. I backed out of the chamber, wedged myself through the narrow fissure, and burst out into the blinding, hot afternoon sun of the basin. I stood there gasping for air, my chest heaving, my uniform torn and covered in gray dust. The sun felt hot on my skin, but I couldn't stop shaking. I didn't run. My training kept me from running. Running triggers a pursuit reflex in every predator in the woods. But I walked. I walked faster than I ever have in my life, heading straight back down the trail toward the cedar bottoms, leaving the basin and the dead man's teeth behind me. By the time I reached the lower valley where the lodgepole pines grew, the sun was setting again, casting long, skeletal shadows across the trail. The smoke had returned thicker now, a dark orange wall that smelled of burning pitch. The silence of the forest was absolute once more. No birds, no bugs, just the sound of my own heavy breathing and the relentless clack-clack of my trekking poles. I knew I couldn't make the trailhead before midnight, and navigating the steep, boulder-strewn switchbacks through the ancient cedar groves in the dark was a recipe for a broken leg. I had to make camp. I didn't want to, but survival logic overrode my panic. I found a small clearing away from the main trail, surrounded by a dense ring of young fir trees that offered some visual concealment. I didn't set up my tent this time. I didn't want to be trapped inside a nylon bag. Instead, I unrolled my sleeping pad directly on the dirt, sat down with my back against a massive solid stump, and pulled my Glock from its holster. I laid it across my lap. I didn't eat. I didn't light a fire. I just sat there in the deepening dark, watching the narrow gaps between the trees. The night was long and cold. The smoke in the air made my eyes water and my throat burn, but I didn't dare cough. Every muscle in my neck was strained from turning my head toward every real or imagined rustle in the brush. Around 3:00 a.m., the temperature plummeted. The air became so cold that the moisture from my breath froze on the collar of my jacket, and then the silence was broken. It didn't start with footsteps this time. It started with a sound that made my skin crawl. The sound of someone trying to whistle, but doing it with an anatomy that wasn't built for it. It was a wet, airy hiss that rose and fell in pitch, trying to mimic a cheerful, casual tune, but failing miserably. It sounded like air being forced through a wet pipe. The sound was coming from the trail, about 30 yards from my clearing. I drew my legs up close to my chest, my thumb resting on the beaver tail of the gun, my eyes wide, staring into the dark gaps between the fir trees. The orange light of the stars filtered through the smoke gave the forest a surreal, hellish tint. The whistling stopped. Then came the voice. It was my voice again, but it was wrong now. It was broken, disjointed, as if the thing was struggling to maintain the integrity of the imitation. The words were jumbled, spliced together from different sentences I had never spoken. Ranger Vance, lost near the lake. Orofino District. Help me. I am. 4 on copy. The voice moved through the trees around my clearing. It wasn't staying on the trail. It was circling me. I could hear the heavy, dragging stride, crunch, drag, crunch, drag, moving through the dry brush, but it was moving with an impossible fluidity, never striking a branch or tripping over a fallen log. It came closer. Through a gap in the young firs, not 15 feet from where I sat, the shadow shifted. The smoky starlight caught the shape as it passed. Through a small opening in the canopy. It was taller than the trees around it. Its impossibly long, thin neck bent forward so its head hung low near its chest. The head was featureless, no eyes, no nose, just a smooth, pale wedge of that dead wood skin that split open across the bottom to reveal a wide, dark cavity where a mouth should be. Inside that cavity there were no teeth, no tongue, just a series of pale, glistening membranes that vibrated rapidly as the voice came out. Michael, it murmured. It used my first name. It hadn't heard that on the radio. It had found my name somewhere else. Maybe from the ID badge in my wallet, or maybe it just knew. The voice was perfect now. An exact intimate replication of my own thoughts spoken aloud. Michael, you left your flashlight. It's cold in the rocks. Come back down to the water. I pressed my back harder against the stump, my teeth chattering so loud I was terrified it would hear them. I held the gun up, aligning the night sights with the shape through the trees, but my hands were shaking so badly the green dots danced wildly in the dark. I knew that if I fired and missed, or if the bullets didn't stop it, I would be dead before I could chamber another round. The thing stopped moving. It stood perfectly still in the gap between the trees, its long skeletal head tilting from side to side, as if it were sniffing the air or listening for the heartbeat it knew was close by. The air in the clearing became thick with that foul, sweet smell of decay, so potent it made my eyes stream with tears. I can hear you breathing, Michael. My own voice whispered from the dark. You sound so tired. I clamped my jaw shut, holding my breath until my lungs burned, my fingers gripping the gun until they went numb. I closed my eyes, preparing for the brush to part, for those long, wood-skinned arms to reach through the dark and drag me into the mountains. But it didn't happen. The thing stood there for what felt like an eternity, an hour of absolute, suffocating terror. Then, with that same wet, clicking sound I had heard in the cave, it turned. It moved away from my clearing, its heavy, dragging stride fading out as it headed back up the ridge, toward the high, dead country of the basin. The voice followed it, growing fainter and fainter, repeating my name over and over until it was nothing more than a trick of the wind. I didn't move until the sun was fully above the eastern horizon. I didn't pack my gear. I left my sleeping pad and my stove lying in the dirt. I took my pack, my gun still drawn in my hand, and I walked out to the trail. I didn't look back. I hiked the remaining 9 miles to the trailhead in a state of hypervigilant shock, every nerve ending in my body fried by adrenaline. When I reached my patrol truck, the Subaru was still there, looking small and pathetic under the giant trees. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and drove down the mountain so fast the tires screamed on the gravel switchbacks. When I got back to the Orofino office, I walked past Arthur without a word, went into the locker room and vomited into the sink. I washed my face, went to my desk, and wrote my report. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't mention the shape or the tracks. I wrote that I found the subject's gear in a remote fissure near the basin, indicating a probable animal attack or fatal fall, and that communication limitations prevented immediate recovery. A full search and rescue team went up the next day with dogs. They found David's gear exactly where I reported it, but the tracking hounds refused to go into the fissure. They lay down in the dirt, howling and snapping at their handlers, their fur standing on end. The search was officially called off after 5 days. David Miller was listed as missing and presumed dead, another tragic statistic in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I resigned from the National Park Service 3 weeks later. I moved out of Idaho, out of the West entirely. I live in a small town in the Midwest now, where the land is flat and cornfields replace the trees for miles in every direction. There are no mountains here, no ancient cedars, no deep canyons where the silence can grow too thick. But I still don't sleep well. Every now and then, usually in the dead of winter when the wind hums low around the corners of my house, I wake up at 2:14 a.m. I sit up in bed, my heart pounding, listening to the quiet streets outside, and sometimes just on the edge of my hearing, I think I can hear a voice coming from the empty road beneath the streetlights. It's a voice I know intimately. It's my own voice, and it's asking me to come back to the woods. My name is Michael Thorne. I am 34 years old, and I have spent the better part of the last decade working as a commissioned park ranger for the United States Forest Service. I am writing this from a small, dimly lit room in a rental house just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, in the year 2026. The events I'm about to recount took place 4 years ago, in the fall of 2022, deep within the Coconino National Forest, specifically in the rugged, unforgiving terrain surrounding the Mogollon Rim. I have held on to this confession because, for a long time I thought that if I put it into words, the logic of the world would somehow force it to make sense, but it hasn't. There are things in the deep timber that do not operate on the terms we dictate, and my experience on the rim changed the way I look at the wilderness. a place I once called my sanctuary, and now view only as a cage with infinite doors. It was late September, the kind of weather in northern Arizona where the days are deceptively mild, tasting of dry pine needles and high-altitude dust, while the nights turn brittle and sharp enough to snap bone. I was stationed at a remote patrol outpost near the edge of the Blue Ridge Ranger District, tasked with monitoring illegal campsites and unauthorized firewood collection, the mundane bread and butter of the job. I was alone that season, which wasn't unusual. My closest colleague, a man named Marcus Miller, who had been with the service for 20 years, was stationed at a station nearly 30 miles to the west, accessible only by a jagged gravel Forest Service road that turned to sludge at the slightest hint of moisture. We spoke over the radio every evening at 6 to run through the status of the district, and that was the extent of my human interaction for the better part of a month. The landscape of the Mogollon Rim is a geological wound, a massive escarpment that slices across the heart of the state. Standing on the edge, you can look out over a drop that feels like the end of the world, staring down into a basin of dense ponderosa pine and scrub oak that shifts colors like bruised fruit as the sun dips behind the horizon. It is beautiful, but it is a heavy beauty. The silence up there isn't empty. It's expectant. It started on a Tuesday, or maybe it was a Wednesday. The days began to bleed together into a singular stretch of gray light and long, cooling shadows. I was driving my patrol truck down an unmapped logging spur, a decommissioned trail that the locals often tried to bypass to reach hidden fishing spots. I caught the scent before I saw anything. Not the smell of rotting game or stagnant water, but something metallic, like a penny held in a warm palm, mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of ozone. It was an out-of-place smell, one that didn't belong to the damp earth or the cooling sap of the trees. I pulled the truck over, the tires crunching loudly against the dry gravel, and stepped out into the quiet. There was no wind. The canopy overhead was so thick it swallowed the sunlight, turning the forest floor into a mosaic of dull, shifting browns. I walked perhaps 50 yards into the brush, my boots sinking into the pine needles until I found it. It wasn't a person and it wasn't a camp. It was a clearing, perfectly circular, about 20 feet in diameter, where the trees didn't just look dead. They looked like they had been stripped of their history. The bark had been peeled away in long uniform ribbons, and the wood underneath was bleached bone white, as if it had been exposed to the sun for decades, though the surrounding forest was thriving and lush. I called out, my voice sounding flat and unconvincing in the heavy air. "Forest Service, is anyone out here?" Nothing. No birds, no insects, not even the scuttle of a squirrel. The silence was so profound it made my ears ache. I walked to the edge of the circle and reached out to touch one of the stripped trunks. The wood wasn't rough or brittle. It was ice cold, unnaturally so, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that I felt in the marrow of my teeth rather than heard with my ears. I pulled my hand back as if burned. I didn't stay to investigate further. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up in a primal, unreasoning panic, the kind that bypasses the brain and hits the stomach, began to claw at me. I retreated to my truck and drove back to the station, telling myself it was some bizarre act of vandalism, some strange hobby of a bored teenager with too much time and a heavy-duty blade. But I couldn't stop thinking about the hum. That evening, when I keyed the mic to talk to Marcus, my voice sounded tight. "Hey, Elias, you sound like you've been chasing a mountain lion," Marcus said, his voice crackling through the radio. "Everything quiet on the rim?" "Just the usual," I lied, looking out the window at the impenetrable darkness of the pines. "Found some weird damage on some timber off the 421 spur. Looks like someone went to town with a knife, but I don't know how they got the bark off so clean." There was a pause, a long stretch of static, and then Marcus's voice dropped an octave. "You stay away from the deep cuts, Elias, you hear me? The older scouts in this area used to tell stories about the rim, back when it was just logging camps and horse trails. They talked about the thinning. Just don't go poking around in places that look like they've been scrubbed clean. Whatever you do, don't go back there after the sun goes down." I didn't ask him to clarify. I didn't want to hear it. I signed off and tried to read, but the book sat forgotten in my lap as I watched the shadows in my cabin lengthen. 2 days later, the rain started. It was a cold, driving rain that turned the forest floor into a treacherous mire. I had work to do, a downed power line that needed documenting, and I had to head out into the muck. I was driving slowly, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the glass, when I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road, a man in a tattered flannel jacket and heavy work boots, his head bowed against the rain. I pulled over, expecting a lost hiker or a stranded camper. I rolled down the window, the cold air hitting me like a slap. "Sir, you okay?" I called out. The man looked up and I felt the air leave my lungs. His face was a mask of confusion, his eyes wide and unfocused, darting around as if he were seeing things that weren't there. He wasn't wet despite the downpour. His clothes were bone dry. "I can't find the road," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "It was right here." The road was right here, and then the lights changed. "What lights?" I asked, reaching for my radio. "Sir, I'm with the Forest Service." "Let me get you into the truck. We'll get you back to the station." "You don't understand," he said, stepping closer to the vehicle. His skin looked wrong, gray and stretched as if it didn't quite fit his frame. "The trees are eating the sound. If you stay in the light, they find you." He reached out a hand, and for a second I saw his fingernails. They weren't fingernails at all. They were jagged, translucent plates like insect chitin. I didn't wait for him to get in. I shifted into reverse and backed up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The man didn't chase me. He just stood there, his arms hanging limp at his sides, watching me with that hollow, terrifying expression of profound distance. As I sped away, I looked in my rearview mirror. He was gone. Not walking into the woods, not hidden by the trees, he was simply gone, as if he had been a projection that had suddenly lost its power. I radioed for backup, my voice shaking. Dispatch told me to hold my position, but I didn't wait. I drove until I hit the paved highway, miles away from the dense canopy. I didn't go back to the station for 2 days. I stayed in a motel in Pine, telling my supervisor that my truck had mechanical issues. They didn't push it. They were short-staffed, and honestly, nobody wanted to spend extra time up on the rim when the weather turned. When I finally went back to the station, I found my door standing open. The cabin had been searched, but not for valuables. My gear was scattered everywhere, my sleeping bag torn open, my charts ripped from the walls. But it wasn't a robbery. It was a pattern. The perpetrator had rearranged my things, stacking them in small, precise circles on the floor, identical to the circle I had found in the woods. I stood in the center of the room, my hand hovering over my sidearm, listening. The house was deathly quiet. Then I heard it, the hum. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the floorboards, a vibration that grew steadily in intensity until I had to cover my ears. The light in the cabin began to shift, the warm glow of the lantern turning a sickly, washed-out violet. I didn't pack. I didn't look back. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the truck, but as I reached for the handle, I saw something in the yard. It was standing near the edge of the tree line. It looked like a man, but it was far too tall, its limbs elongated and thin, swaying in the wind like a willow branch. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where features should have been. And as it turned toward me, I realized it was wearing my clothes, my service uniform, complete with the badge I had left on my dresser. I didn't think. I moved. I jumped into the truck and floored it, the tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. I didn't look at the rearview mirror until I was 5 miles down the road. When I finally risked a glance, I saw them. Not one, but 3 of them, standing in the middle of the gravel road, perfectly still, their forms flickering in and out of existence like a bad film reel. They weren't hunting me. That was the most terrifying part. They were observing me, measuring me, as if I were a specimen being collected for some vast, incomprehensible study. I left the forest that night and never went back to retrieve my belongings. I quit the service a week later, citing personal reasons and a burnout that wasn't entirely a lie. I moved to Flagstaff, but even here in the city, the silence at night feels heavy. I wake up sometimes in the dead of the dark, and for a heartbeat I hear that hum again, that low, vibrating frequency that tells me the circle isn't finished. I don't know what they were. I don't know if they were ghosts or something older, something that lived in the seams of this land long before we arrived to carve our lines on maps and call it a national forest. I only know that when you are out there, deep in the timber, and the birds stop singing and the air begins to taste like ozone, you aren't the one in charge of the woods anymore. You become part of the quiet. Sometimes, I find myself standing on the edge of the city, looking toward the north, toward the silhouette of the rim, I wonder if my uniform is still out there, folded neatly in some clearing, or if the trees have finally finished their work. I wonder if somewhere in that vast, dark expanse, there is another version of me, still sitting at his desk waiting for a radio call that will never come, existing in a space where the road is never where it's supposed to be. And then I think, what happens when the circle closes? I don't have an answer, and honestly, I don't want one. I just lock my door, turn up the radio, and try to ignore the fact that the streetlights outside my window have started to flicker in a rhythmic, pulsing pattern that looks an awful lot like a warning. Do you ever feel like the world is just a little bit too thin? Like if you pushed hard enough, you might fall through to somewhere else?